On the morning of the 26th of May, 1940, a British soldier is standing on a beach in northern France. He is not alone. Stretching away from him in both directions, as far as he can see, are more men. Hundreds, thousands. They stand in long, patient queues leading into the sea, wading out to wherever the water is shallow enough to stand and deep enough to receive a small boat. The sea is cold. The men have been standing in it for hours. Above them, German aircraft come in low and strafe the beach. The men in the queue do not break and run. There is nowhere to run. They shuffle forward, a few inches at a time, toward the water. The ships are offshore. There are not enough of them. There are never enough of them. And behind the waiting men, the German army is advancing. What happens over the next 9 days is one of the most extraordinary events of the Second World War. It is not a victory. Winston Churchill, the day the evacuation ended, said in the House of Commons, "Wars are not won by evacuations." But it was something. To understand what Dunkirk was, you have to understand how it happened. In May of 1940, Germany launched its invasion of France and the Low Countries. The strategy was not a straightforward assault along the front. It was a masterstroke of armored penetration through the Ardennes, a region of forests and hills in southern Belgium that the French High Command had considered impassable for tanks. The tanks passed through it in 3 days. They emerged behind the Allied lines, cutting off the British Expeditionary Force and a large portion of the French army from their supply lines and their retreat. By the 17th of May, over 300,000 Allied soldiers were caught in a tightening pocket, with the sea at their backs and the German armor pressing from 3 sides. The British commander, Lord Gort, made a decision that military historians have argued about ever since. He ordered the BEF to stop trying to break through the German lines and instead to fall back toward the coast, toward the one port that might offer any possibility of evacuation. That port was Dunkirk. On the 24th of May, something happened that no one in the Allied command fully understood at the time. The German panzers stopped. Hitler, consulting with Field Marshal von Rundstedt and others, issued what became known as the Halt Order. The armored advance, which had been advancing at a pace that would have reached the coast and cut off any possibility of evacuation within days, was ordered to stop. Why? The debate has not been conclusively settled. Theories include Göring's insistence that the Luftwaffe could finish the job from the air, sparing the tanks for the second phase of the invasion of France. Rundstedt's concern that his panzers were outrunning their supply lines. The soft ground of the Flanders coast, unsuitable for armor. A possible belief on Hitler's part that Britain might negotiate if its army escaped. Or some combination of all of these. What the Halt Order gave the Allies was time. 48 hours. And then, eventually, 9 full days. It was enough. Operation Dynamo, the official name for the Dunkirk evacuation, was authorized on the 26th of May. The British Admiralty put out a call for vessels. Any vessel that could operate in shallow water, that could ferry men from a beach to a larger ship offshore or carry men directly back to England. Lifeboats, pleasure craft, fishing smacks, river ferries, private motor yachts, paddle steamers, Thames barges. The response was extraordinary. Over 700 vessels answered the call. Some were crewed by naval ratings. Many were crewed by their civilian owners. Men who had spent their lives sailing the south coast of England for pleasure, for commerce, for the sea itself, and who now pointed their boats toward occupied France. One of those men was Charles Lightoller. He was 74 years old in 1940. He had retired from the sea 26 years earlier. Before that, he had been the second officer of the RMS Titanic, the most senior officer to survive the sinking, the last man to leave the ship before it went under. He had a private motor yacht, the Sundowner, 60 feet long, built for comfort, licensed to carry 21 passengers. When the call went out for small vessels, Lightoller brought the Sundowner himself. He set out from the Thames estuary on the morning of the 1st of June, with his son Roger as crew and a teenage sea scout named Gerald Ashcroft who had happened to be visiting when the orders came. They crossed the channel through dive bomber attacks, through the bodies of men floating in the water, through the black smoke rising from the burning port of Dunkirk. They reached the beaches. Men came swimming out to the Sundowner. Lightoller piled them in. By the time he pushed off from the shore, he had 130 men aboard a boat licensed for 21. The Sundowner was sitting so low in the water that the deck was barely above the surface. He brought them all home. He navigated the crossing back to Ramsgate with the boat dangerously overloaded, periodically ordering men to move fore or aft to trim the balance, refusing to panic, refusing to acknowledge the possibility that the vessel might founder. He had been on the bridge when the Titanic went down. He had held men by their arms in the water until the lifeboat came. He knew, in some specific and experiential way, the difference between a situation that was over and a situation that still had a chance. This had a chance. On the beaches, the experience was different for every man. Some waited hours in queues that moved inches at a time, under sporadic strafing, maintaining an order that was the result not of any single command but of a collective British disinclination to make things worse by panicking. Others were less orderly. There were men who lost their nerve, men who pushed and fought, men who drowned getting to boats that capsized under the weight of men climbing in. The destroyers offshore, the Royal Navy ships large enough to take several hundred men at a time, were a constant target for the Luftwaffe. Several were sunk with heavy loss of life. HMS Wakeful was torpedoed and sank in 14 seconds. HMS Grafton, HMS Grenade, HMS Keith, all lost. The men who died at Dunkirk are part of the story. The evacuation is remembered as a miracle because it worked. But over 3,000 men died in the water and on the beach during those 9 days. The story that is least told about Dunkirk is the story of the rearguard. When the evacuation ended on the 4th of June, not everyone had gotten off. A substantial portion of the French army, the soldiers who had held the Dunkirk perimeter to give the BF time to evacuate, were still on the beaches. In the final days of Operation Dynamo, about 40,000 French soldiers were evacuated. But tens of thousands more were not. The last French divisions holding the perimeter fought until they ran out of ammunition and surrendered. They had kept the perimeter long enough for the British to get away. The British mostly got away. The French mostly did not. General Maxime Weygand, the French commander, later said that Britain had left France to fight alone. The relationship between the two countries, already strained by the chaos of the collapse, was made more complicated by Dunkirk's arithmetic. It is a part of the story that the celebrations of Dunkirk have sometimes minimized. 338,226 men were evacuated from Dunkirk between the 26th of May and the 4th of June, 1940. It is an extraordinary number. Given what the German armor could have done if the Halt Order had not been issued, given the chaos and the losses at sea and the inadequacy of the available vessels, the number should have been much smaller. Churchill's speech to Parliament on the 4th of June is the one everyone knows. We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall never surrender. What is often forgotten is what he said before that. The British Empire and the French Republic, linked together in their cause and in their need, will defend to the death their native soil, aiding each other like good comrades to the utmost of their strength. He was trying to bind together an alliance that Dunkirk had strained. What Dunkirk saved is clearer in retrospect than it was in the summer of 1940. The core of the British Army, its trained officers and experienced non-commissioned officers, its regimental structures, its institutional knowledge, came home from France. Without them, there was no army capable of resisting an invasion. With them, there was something to build on. The pilots who had flown cover over Dunkirk, and many of them died over Dunkirk, and this is largely forgotten, flew in the Battle of Britain that summer. The officers who had held the queues together on the beaches commanded the battalions that returned to France on D-Day. The evacuation preserved the possibility of a long war. A long war was the only war Britain could win. The beach at Dunkirk today is a resort beach. It is wide and flat and sandy, with the kind of gray light that the English Channel provides for most of the year. There is a memorial to the evacuation and a small museum. The town itself is industrial. Dunkirk was bombed and rebuilt after the war, and it does not look like it did in 1940. But the beach is the same beach. In early June, when the light comes in low over the water and the sea is quiet, you can walk along it and find, if you look carefully, the occasional corroded piece of metal in the sand. A belt buckle. canteen. The edge of something that was brought to this beach in a great hurry and did not go back. Not everything was recovered. Not everyone came home. But more did than should have, by any military calculation, by any reasonable expectation of what 9 days in an open field against the German army could possibly produce. 338,000 men. The Sundowner, loaded 30 feet deep in soldiers on a boat meant for 20. Charles Lightoller, 74 years old, not yet done with the sea. If this story moved you, subscribe to follow the Untold Front. New stories every week.